Close your eyes for a moment and imagine that everything you know about human history is incomplete. That the story of civilization, the one they taught you in school, the one preserved in textbooks and museums, is not the beginning but merely a chapter. A single chapter in a book with pages torn out, burned, buried beneath miles of sediment and the crushing weight of forgotten time. What if humanity has walked this path before? Not once, but 6 times. 6 complete cycles of rise and fall, of brilliant achievement and catastrophic destruction. And we, you and I, living in our cities of steel and glass, sending our signals into space, believing ourselves to be the pinnacle of progress. What if we are simply the 7th attempt? The 7th civilization to emerge from the ashes of a cosmic reset that erases almost everything, leaving only whispers in clay and stone. This is not science fiction. This is a theory drawn from the oldest written records known to humanity, etched into clay tablets in the sweltering heat of ancient Mesopotamia nearly 5,000 years ago. The Sumerians, those remarkable people who gave us writing, mathematics, the wheel, and the very concept of recorded history, left us something else, something that scholars have struggled to interpret, dismissed as myth, or simply ignored because it doesn't fit the comfortable narrative of linear human progress. They left us a chronicle of time that extends far beyond what we accept as possible. They left us a record of catastrophic cycles. They left us the suggestion that we are not the first and that we almost certainly won't be the last. Before we dive deeper into this revelation, ignite that like button and prepare for a journey that will challenge everything you thought you knew about our species and our world. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there, and whether this possibility fills you with wonder or dread. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Close your eyes if you wish, let the darkness be your canvas, and let these ancient voices paint a picture that has been hidden for millennia. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself. Let's dive in. You're standing in silence, not the silence of an empty room, but the profound, almost sacred silence of a museum after hours. The British Museum, London, 1872. The halls are dark, lit only by flickering gas lamps that cast dancing shadows across walls lined with artifacts from worlds long dead. You can hear your own breathing, feel the cool marble beneath your feet, smell the particular mustiness that clings to ancient things. And there, hunched over a wooden desk covered in clay fragments, sits a man whose hands are trembling. His name is George Smith. He's not a scholar, not a professor trained in the hallowed halls of Oxford or Cambridge. He is a banknote engraver, a working-class man who taught himself to read cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing of the ancient Mesopotamians, through sheer obsession and countless hours staring at these broken pieces of the past. For months, Smith has been piecing together thousands of clay tablet fragments excavated from the ruins of Nineveh, the ancient Assyrian capital in what is now Iraq. The tablets come from the library of King Ashurbanipal, a collection assembled in the 7th century BC, but containing copies of texts far, far older. Tonight, Smith is working on a particularly challenging set of pieces. The clay is brittle, the writing worn but still legible to his trained eye. And as he fits one fragment to another, as the ancient symbols align and the words emerge from the darkness of 4,000 years, he reads something that makes him freeze. His breath catches. His hands, those steady engraver's hands, begin to shake uncontrollably. He is reading a story of a great flood, a divinely sent deluge designed to wipe humanity from the face of the earth. A man warned by a god to build a massive boat. Instructions to take his family, craftsmen and the seed of all living creatures. The boat sealed with bitumen. The storm that lasted for days. The waters that covered everything. The bird sent out to find dry land. The sacrifice made after emerging into a drowned world. It is the story of Noah and the Ark. But it isn't from the Bible. This account was written at least 1,000 years before the earliest Hebrew scriptures. The Sumerians and their cultural descendants, the Babylonians, knew this story intimately. They called their flood survivor Utnapishtim, and they recorded it as history, not as spiritual parable, but as an actual event that divided the ages. What Smith discovered that night in 1872 sent shockwaves through Victorian society. It challenged the very foundations of biblical authority and Western understanding of the past. But here is what most people don't realise. The discovery of the flood story was only the beginning. Embedded within these same ancient texts, and others discovered in the decades that followed, was something far more disturbing than a single catastrophic event. It was evidence that the Great Flood was not unique, but was instead the most recent in a series of cosmic catastrophes that have repeatedly ended human civilization and forced us to begin again from almost nothing. The tablets that Smith and others translated tell of a time before the flood when kings ruled for impossibly long periods. The Sumerian King List, one of the most controversial and baffling documents from the ancient world, begins with a simple but profound statement. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, and then it lists the rulers of the first 5 cities before the flood, along with the lengths of their reigns. These are not mentioned in normal numbers. King Alalim of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years. His successor Alalgar ruled for 36,000 years. 8 kings in total spanning a combined 241,200 years of rule, before the text matter-of-factly states, then the flood swept over. Mainstream scholars, of course, view these numbers as mythological symbolic representations of antiquity and divine legitimacy. No human being lives for 28,000 years, let alone rules for that length of time. The numbers are clearly inflated, perhaps to emphasize the sacred nature of these early rulers, perhaps as a political tool to establish the unbroken ancient lineage of later kings. This is the safe, rational interpretation. But what if the scholars are reading the text too literally, and not literally enough at the same time? What if the Sumerian scribes were recording something real, but in a way we don't understand because we lack the proper context? Some researchers have proposed that these impossibly long reigns represent not individual human lifespans, but the duration of entire dynasties or eras. Others suggest that the Sumerians were using a different unit of time, that their year was perhaps a month or a season, and when converted to our calendar, the numbers become more reasonable. But there is a third, more radical interpretation. What if these were not human kings at all? What if the Sumerian King List is a record of rulership by beings who are not subject to normal human mortality? Beings whose existence measured in tens of thousands of years was simply factual, and who governed humanity during epochs so ancient that they preceded not just written history, but perhaps earlier versions of civilization itself. This interpretation becomes more compelling when you notice what happens after the flood in the King List. The numbers change dramatically. After the flood swept over and kingship descended from heaven a second time, the reigns become shorter. The first post-Diluvian king ruled for 1,200 years, still fantastically long by our standards, but a dramatic reduction from 28,000. And as you read down the list through subsequent generations, the numbers keep decreasing. Eventually you reach names that historians can actually verify through other archaeological evidence. You reach Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, listed with a reign of 126 years. Still long, but approaching the realm of the possible, especially given the ancient accounts of extreme human longevity in the earliest post-flood generations. This gradual normalization of reign length suggests something fascinating. It suggests that the King List is not pure myth, but rather a document that blends the mythological past with emerging historical reality. It records a transition from a world governed by beings of vast age and power to a world governed by normal humans with normal lifespans. A transition from one age to another. And crucially, that transition is marked by a cataclysm. The flood was not just a random disaster. It was a reset point, a cosmic boundary between one cycle of civilization and the next. But this raises the most important question of all. If the flood was a reset, was it the first, or was it simply the most recent in a series of resets that stretch back into the unimaginable depths of time? To answer this question, we need to look at what the Sumerian tablets actually say about the structure of time and the nature of existence itself. And this is where the story becomes even stranger, where the ancient world seems to whisper a secret that we have been too frightened or too proud to hear. The Sumerians did not view time the way we do. We live in a culture that embraces the idea of linear progress, of history as an arrow pointing always forward and upward. We believe that humanity started in primitive ignorance and through hard work and ingenuity has climbed to ever greater heights of knowledge and achievement. This is the grand narrative of the modern world. But the Sumerians, and indeed most ancient cultures, saw time very differently. They saw it as cyclical, as a great wheel turning through ages of rise and fall, of golden ages descending into darkness before being renewed again. This cyclical view of time was not pessimistic fatalism. It was observation. It was pattern recognition born from the experience of watching civilizations collapse, from living through periods of chaos and reconstruction, from preserving memories of catastrophes that had come before. The concept appears across multiple ancient cultures. The Hindus speak of the Yugas, 4 ages that cycle from the Satya Yuga, a golden age of truth and virtue, down through progressive decline to the Kali Yuga, an age of darkness and ignorance before the cycle begins anew. A complete cycle takes 4.32 million years, a time span that boggles the mind. The ancient Greeks described ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, each worse than the one before until the gods wipe the slate clean and begin again. The Mayans tracked vast cycles of creation and destruction in their long-count calendar. The Norse myths speak of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, when the world burns and drowns before being reborn from the waters. These are not isolated beliefs. They are a global phenomenon, a common memory preserved in culture after culture that had no contact with one another. But the Sumerian tablets go further. They don't just acknowledge cycles in poetic, mythological terms. They attempt to quantify them, to measure them, to record the actual history of these cycles wars. And when you dig into these texts, when you follow the breadcrumbs they leave scattered across thousands of years of writing, a disturbing pattern emerges. The pattern suggests that the flood documented in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Eridu was not the first catastrophic reset. It was merely the most recent one that the Sumerians still remembered clearly enough to write about in detail. Before that flood, there were others. Before those floods, there were other methods of destruction. Fire from the sky, the earth opening up and swallowing cities, darkness that lasted for days or weeks, the gods growing angry and deciding to wipe the board clean and start over. Now, we must address the elephant in the room. The theory that is whispered in alternative archaeology circles, discussed in forums and documentaries, but rarely taken seriously by mainstream academia. The theory that we are the 7th civilization. This idea claims that the Sumerian tablets, when properly understood, reveal that there have been 6 complete cycles of human civilization before ours. 6 rises from primitive beginnings to heights of achievement and knowledge. 6 catastrophic falls that erased nearly everything, leaving only scattered survivors to preserve fragments of the old wisdom and pass them down through oral tradition until writing could be invented again to record them. And we, living in our 7th age, are approaching the same crossroads that each of the previous civilizations faced. Where does this theory come from? It is not explicitly stated in the tablets in clear, simple terms. Ancient texts rarely are. They are written in poetic, symbolic language that requires interpretation. The theory emerges from careful analysis of several different sources. First, there are the references in the King List and other Sumerian texts to multiple cities being established, destroyed and re-established before the Great Flood. Eridu, the first city, is described as the place where kingship first descended from heaven, but other texts mention earlier settlements, earlier attempts at civilization that failed. The text known as the Eridu Genesis, the oldest Mesopotamian flood myth we have, begins with a description of the creation of humanity and then implies an earlier unsuccessful attempt at establishing cities before the successful founding of the 5 pre-flood cities. Second, there are references in other ancient texts to multiple creations and destructions. The Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, describes how the god Marduk creates the world from the body of the chaos dragon Tiamat. But it is not the first creation. The text implies previous iterations, previous arrangements of the cosmos that were unstable or unsatisfactory. In the Atrahasis epic, the gods create humanity to take over labour in the mines and fields, but there is a strong implication that this is not the first time they have tried this solution. There are hints of earlier, failed versions of humans that were not fit for purpose. Third, there are the enigmatic numbers themselves. The Sumerian mathematical system was based on 60, not 10 like ours. They used a number called a shah, which represented 3,600. This number appears repeatedly in their texts related to cosmic cycles and divine timekeeping. Some researchers have proposed that a shah represents not just a mathematical unit, but a unit of cosmic time, the period of a great cycle. If you take the 241,200 years of pre-Diluvian kingship and divide it by 3,600, you get 67. If you take the idea that there were multiple floods, multiple resets before the final Great Deluge that is remembered in the Gilgamesh epic, and you map out the implied timeline, you can construct a model where humanity has gone through approximately 6 major catastrophic cycles before reaching our current era. Now, is this interpretation definitive? No. Is it supported by mainstream archaeology and textual analysis? Absolutely not. The scholarly consensus is clear. The impossibly long rains are mythological. The floods are either entirely fictional or represent cultural memories of local flooding events in Mesopotamia, which was prone to devastating inundations by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The creation myths are theological texts, not historical records. They exist to explain the relationship between gods and humans, to legitimize kingship and the social order, not to preserve actual chronological data about past ages. But here is what makes the seventh civilization theory compelling despite academic rejection. The Sumerians were not naive, primitive people inventing fantasy stories. They were sophisticated, organised, highly educated scribes working in established schools where they meticulously copied and preserved texts that were already ancient in their time. They understood the difference between history and myth. They kept detailed administrative records, trade documents, legal codes, astronomical observations. They had different words for different types of texts. They knew what they were writing. And they chose to preserve these stories about the deep past, about the time before the flood, about kings who ruled for millennia, about gods who walked among humans and taught them the arts of civilization. Why, if these texts were understood to be complete fiction, why bother preserving them with such care? Why reference them in contexts that seem historical? The answer might be that these texts contained something the Sumerians considered vitally important. Not necessarily literal historical fact, but truth. Truth about the nature of existence, about the relationship between humanity and cosmic forces, about the fragility of civilization, and crucially, about the pattern of destruction and rebirth that governs our world. What if the seventh civilization theory is not about proving that there were literally 6 previous complete technological civilizations that left no trace except in myth? What if it is about something deeper and more disturbing? What if it is about recognizing that the rise of civilization is not inevitable, not permanent, not guaranteed? What if it is about understanding that there is a cosmic clock ticking, a rhythm to existence that operates on timescales we can barely comprehend, and that clock has struck midnight before, many times before, and it will strike again? The question then becomes not whether we are literally the 7th attempt, but whether we are doomed to repeat the pattern that all previous iterations of human civilization have followed. The pattern of hubris, the pattern of believing we are untouchable, the pattern of ignoring the warnings written in stone and clay by those who came before. And if we are doomed to repeat it, is there any way to break the cycle? Or is the cycle itself an inescapable law of existence, as fundamental as gravity, that ensures no civilization ever survives long enough to escape the confines of its cradle world? This is the true terror and the true power of the seventh civilization theory. It is not a statement of archaeological fact. It is a mirror held up to our own age, reflecting back our vulnerabilities, our arrogance, and the very real possibility that everything we have built could vanish in a geological instant, leaving future survivors to pick through the ruins and wonder what kind of gods we must have been. To understand whether this pattern is real, we need to step away from the clay tablets for a moment and look at what the Earth itself is trying to tell us. Because the planet keeps its own records, written not in cuneiform but in layers of rock, in cores drilled from ice, in the scattered bones of extinct megafauna, and in the chemical signatures of catastrophe preserved across multiple continents. And those records tell a story that is terrifyingly consistent with the ancient myths of cyclical destruction. The field of geology was built on a principle called uniformitarianism, the idea that the same gradual processes we see operating today, erosion, sedimentation, volcanic activity, have operated throughout Earth's history. Change is slow, steady, and predictable. James Hutton, Geological, one of the founders of modern geology, famously said he could see no vestige of a beginning and no prospect of an end. This view was revolutionary in the 18th and 19th centuries because it challenged the biblical chronology that placed creation at around 4000 BC. It gave Earth a vast, almost unimaginable age. But it also created a new orthodoxy, one that dismissed catastrophism, the older view that Earth's features were shaped by sudden violent events. For most of the 20th century, this uniformitarian view dominated. Catastrophic events were minimized or explained away. The idea that civilizations could be wiped out by sudden cosmic disasters was relegated to pseudoscience. But then the evidence started mounting, evidence that could not be ignored. Evidence that uniformitarianism, while useful, was incomplete. Earth's history is not one of gentle change. It is punctuated by periods of shocking, catastrophic violence that reshape continents, trigger mass extinctions, and would absolutely annihilate any civilization unlucky enough to be in the way. Let's start with the Younger Dryas, an event that occurred approximately 12,800 years ago. The Earth was warming, emerging from the last ice age. Glaciers were retreating, sea levels rising, and megafauna, mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, roamed a landscape that was gradually becoming more hospitable to human life. Archaeological evidence suggests that human populations were beginning to settle, to develop more sophisticated tool technologies. The Clovis culture in North America was thriving, hunting the great beasts and spreading across the continent. And then, suddenly, everything changed. The warming stopped. Temperatures plummeted. In some regions, they dropped by as much as 15 degrees Celsius in less than a decade. A decade? Imagine experiencing that today. Imagine the panic, the crop failures, the death. This cold snap, called the Younger Dryas period, lasted for approximately 1,200 years before ending as abruptly as it began. When it was over, the megafauna were gone. The Clovis culture had vanished from the archaeological record, and human populations had been dramatically reduced. For decades, the cause of the Younger Dryas was debated. The leading theory involved the sudden drainage of a massive glacial lake, Lake Agassiz, which dumped enormous quantities of fresh water into the North Atlantic, disrupting ocean currents and triggering rapid cooling. This is still considered the most likely primary mechanism by mainstream science. But there is another hypothesis, one that has been fiercely debated, alternatively championed and dismissed, but which refuses to go away. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. This theory, first formally proposed in 2007 by a team led by Richard Firestone and Alan West, suggests that approximately 12,800 years ago, Earth passed through a debris stream from a fragmenting comet. Rather than a single massive impact, the planet was hit by multiple airbursts and impacts across North America, Europe, and Asia. These impacts would have triggered continental-scale wildfires, whose smoke and soot blocked out the sun. The heat from the impacts and firestorms would have caused rapid melting of the ice sheets, creating massive flooding. The combination of soak-induced cooling and disruption of ocean circulation would explain the sudden temperature plunge. The evidence presented for this impact includes a layer found at dozens of sites across 4 continents that dates to the Younger Dryas boundary. This layer contains microscopic diamonds called nanodiamonds, which can only form under the extreme temperatures and pressures of an impact. It contains high concentrations of platinum and iridium, elements rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids and comets. It contains magnetic spherules, tiny balls of melted rock consistent with impact events. It contains a massive charcoal layer indicating continent-wide fires, and it sits directly atop the archaeological layers containing Clovis artifacts and megafauna bones, with a dramatic discontinuity above where both are suddenly absent. Now, this hypothesis has been intensely contested. Multiple teams have attempted to replicate the findings, with mixed results. Critics argue that the evidence can be explained by terrestrial processes, that the materials found are not unique to impacts, and that many of the claimed impact markers have been found at other sites that have nothing to do with the Younger Dryas. Some scientists have published papers with titles like The Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, a requiem, declaring the theory dead. But other research teams have continued to find supporting evidence at additional sites. The debate remains very much alive, and interestingly, some of the most vociferous early critics have moderated their positions as new data has emerged. What does this have to do with the seventh civilization theory? Everything. Because if the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is correct, or even partly correct, it means that human civilization in its earliest, most vulnerable form was nearly exterminated by a cosmic catastrophe 12,800 years ago. And if it happened once, it can happen again. In fact, geological and archaeological evidence suggests it has happened before, multiple times. Consider Gobekli Tepe. This site in southeastern Turkey, dating to approximately 9,600 BC, shortly after the Younger Dryas, has rewritten what we thought we knew about the capabilities of prehistoric humans. It consists of massive carved stone pillars arranged in circular enclosures, decorated with intricate reliefs of animals and abstract symbols. weighing many tons each, requiring organised labour from hundreds of people to construct. And it was built by hunter-gatherers, people who, according to the old archaeological models, should not have had the social organisation, the technology, or the motivation to create monumental architecture. You're supposed to settle down, invent agriculture, establish cities, and then build temples. Gobekli Tepe does it backward. It builds the temple first. The site's excavator, Klaus Schmidt, proposed that Gobekli Tepe represents a transition point, that the immense collaborative effort required to build and maintain the site actually led to settlement and agriculture, not the other way around. But there is another interpretation, one that fits disturbingly well with the idea of cyclical catastrophe. What if Gobekli Tepe was not built by people discovering civilization for the first time? What if it was built by survivors of a previous civilization? People who possessed inherited knowledge of construction, organisation, and astronomy, but who had lost most of their technology and material culture in a cataclysm? What if Gobekli Tepe is not the birth of civilization, but its rebirth? Look at the sophistication of the construction. The pillars are perfectly shaped T-forms, some weighing 20 tons, quarried, transported, and erected with tools that archaeologists have not found in sufficient quantity or sophistication to explain the achievement. Look at the astronomical alignments, the geometric precision in the layout of the enclosures. Look at the artistic skill in the carvings, the understanding of human and animal anatomy. And then look at what happens after Gobekli Tepe. Around 8000 BC, the site is deliberately buried. Not destroyed, not abandoned, but carefully, systematically buried under tons of fill dirt. And then the people move down into the plains and establish the first farming communities. The first proto-cities that will eventually become Sumerian civilization. Why bury a sacred site? Why preserve it so carefully by entombing it? Perhaps because they knew, perhaps because they had a cultural memory of previous destructions and wanted to ensure that evidence of their achievement would survive the next one. This pattern appears elsewhere. Across the ancient world, we find sites that are far older and more sophisticated than they should be, according to conventional timelines. We find evidence of flooding on a massive scale, not just local river floods but catastrophic inundations that carve new landscapes. We find layers of ash and fire across multiple continents, dated to roughly the same periods. We find extinction events where dozens of species vanish within archaeological moments. And we find long gaps in the human record, periods where populations seem to collapse, technology regresses, and then slowly, painfully, rebuilds over centuries or millennia. The geological record is not smooth. It is jagged, punctuated by crises that reset the clock. The question is not whether catastrophes happen. They obviously do. The question is whether these catastrophes are random or cyclical. Is Earth just unlucky, getting hit by impacts and volcanic events and climate shifts at unpredictable intervals? Or is there a pattern, a rhythm, a cosmic clock, as the Sumerians suggested, that brings destruction at regular intervals? Some researchers, looking at the data, believe they have found that pattern. They point to cycles linked to the solar system's movement through the galaxy, to variations in Earth's orbit and axial tilt, to periodic comet swarms intersecting our planet's orbit. They point to the 26,000-year cycle of axial precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that ancient cultures obsessively tracked and recorded in their sacred monuments and calendars. They point to evidence suggesting that approximately every 12,000 to 13,000 years, corresponding to half of the precession cycle, Earth experiences a period of instability, a window when catastrophic events cluster together. And if you map out these proposed cycles and count backward through the geological and archaeological record, you find roughly 6 major transition points before our current era. 6 potential reset events. Is this proof? No. Science requires rigorous, reproducible evidence. And the cyclical catastrophe theory remains highly controversial. Many geologists and archaeologists reject it entirely, pointing to the lack of a clear mechanism that would cause such regular events and to the dangers of cherry-picking data to fit a predetermined pattern. But the theory will not die because the anomalies will not go away. The ancient texts that describe previous worlds and ages of gods, the megalithic sites that seem too sophisticated for their supposed place in the timeline, the genetic bottlenecks in the human population that indicate sharp reductions in numbers at specific points in the past, the flood myths that appear in every culture on every continent, describing not just water but fire from the sky, darkness, the earth shaking and the world being remade. What if the Sumerians were right? What if they looked back into their own deep history, preserved in oral tradition and temple records, and saw a pattern? What if they understood that their own flourishing civilization, with its cities and writing and ziggurats, existed on borrowed time? What if they tried to warn us, encoding the knowledge into tablets that would last, hoping that someday someone would read them and understand? And what if we are living in the 7th iteration of that pattern, blind to the warnings, convinced of our own permanence, racing toward the same cliff that claimed all the others? The weight of this possibility is crushing. It suggests that all human achievement, every discovery, every work of art, every act of love and sacrifice exists in the shadow of inevitable destruction. It suggests that the cosmos itself is structured in a way that prevents any civilization from lasting, that there is a built-in expiration date, a reset mechanism that ensures the board is wiped clean before any species becomes too successful, too powerful, too permanent. It is the ultimate cosmic horror, the realization that we are not the masters of our fate but actors in a play whose ending has been written long ago, a play that has been performed 6 times before and will be performed again. But there is another way to look at this, another implication hidden in the theory of 7 civilizations. If we are the 7th, it means 6 came before us. 6 attempts that failed, yes, but 6 attempts that tried. 6 groups of survivors who picked themselves up from the ashes, who refused to let their species die, who rebuilt knowing or sensing that destruction would come again. 6 iterations of humanity that chose to create, to build, to record their wisdom even in the face of futility. And we are their descendants. We carry their genes, their stories, their stubborn refusal to surrender to the void. The Sumerian tablets do not just speak of destruction, they speak of survival, of the gods or advanced beings, or simply the wise ones, who warned certain individuals when disaster was coming. Of arks built and seeds preserved, of knowledge passed down through the flames, of humanity being tested again and again and somehow, impossibly, passing the test by the narrowest of margins. The 7th civilization theory, if true, is not a prophecy of doom. It is a testament to resilience. It is proof that we have faced the worst the universe can throw at us 6 times before and we are still here, still building, still dreaming, still reaching for the stars despite knowing that the ground beneath us is not as solid as it seems. Let's talk about knowledge. If previous civilizations rose and fell, what happened to their wisdom, their technology, their achievements? How does a species that has invented writing, mathematics and architecture lose it all and have to start over? This is one of the main objections to the cyclical civilization theory. Critics point out that if advanced societies existed before us, where are their ruins? Where are the plastic bottles, the concrete foundations, the metal artifacts? Where is the undeniable physical proof that would force us to rewrite history? The answer lies in understanding just how completely a catastrophic event can erase evidence of a civilization and how quickly nature reclaims what we build. Consider what would happen if human civilization collapsed today, right now, due to some global catastrophe. Within 100 years, most of our cities would be unrecognizable, choked with vegetation, structures collapsing as water and the roots undermine foundations. Within 1,000 years, almost everything wooden would be gone. Most buildings would be rubble. Within 10,000 years, the only things remaining would be some stone monuments, the largest concrete structures in the driest climates, and a thin layer of plastics and metals in the geological strata. If a future civilization arose 50,000 years from now, they might find almost nothing of us except for some puzzling anomalies in rock layers, and perhaps the radioactive signature of our nuclear age. Now consider that the proposed previous civilizations would not have been technological in the way we are. They would not have had internal combustion engines, factories or satellites. If they existed, they would have operated at a different level, perhaps with a different focus. The megalithic structures we do find, Gobekli Tepe, the pyramids, Stonehenge, sites in South America like Pumapunku and Sacsayhuaman, suggest civilizations that excelled at stonework, at astronomical observation, at harnessing the power of focused human labour, and possibly at technologies we don't understand because we are looking for the wrong things. If a previous iteration had advanced knowledge of acoustics, of using sound and vibration to move massive stones, or if they had mastered a form of chemistry that allowed them to soften stone temporarily for carving, we wouldn't necessarily recognise the evidence because we assume such things are impossible. But the most important form of knowledge is not technological, it is conceptual. It is mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, social organisation, writing, and there is a curious pattern in the archaeological record regarding these concepts. They seem to appear suddenly in multiple places around the world at roughly the same time, shortly after the Younger Dryas. The first cities in Mesopotamia, the first monumental architecture in Turkey, the first farming in multiple centres across the globe, the first writing systems. According to the standard model, all of these innovations were invented independently by people who had been hunter-gatherers just a few generations earlier. Possible, yes, but there is another explanation. What if these innovations were not invented but remembered? What if small groups of survivors from the pre-Younger Dryas world preserved conceptual knowledge even after losing physical tools and infrastructure? What if they became the teachers, the wise ones, the gods of mythology who descended and gave humanity the gifts of civilization? This is precisely what the ancient texts claim. The Sumerian tablets speak of the Apkallu, the 7 sages who lived before the flood and who brought all knowledge to humanity. They are described as fishmen or as wearing fish-skin cloaks, which scholars interpret as symbolic of wisdom emerging from the waters. But what if they were real individuals or a real group who survived an aquatic catastrophe and who retained knowledge from the previous age? Egyptian tradition speaks of the Zep Tepi, the first time, a golden age of gods who ruled before the pharaohs. Hindu texts describe the rishis, the ancient seers who preserved the Vedas through cosmic catastrophes. Mesoamerican legends tell of Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha, bearded wise men who appeared after great destruction and taught the people agriculture, architecture, and astronomy. Across cultures that never contacted each other, we find the same story. Knowledge bringers appearing in the aftermath of catastrophe. Teachers who are described as different from normal humans, who possess advanced understanding, who establish the foundations of civilization, and then depart or fade into the background, leaving their students to continue the work. This could all be mythological, a common archetype that arises naturally in human storytelling, or it could be a preserved memory of a real historical phenomenon. The survivors of a previous cycle taking on the role of guides and instructors for the next iteration of humanity. If you were one of those survivors, if you had watched your world burn and drown, if you had lost almost everything but retained knowledge, wouldn't you feel a responsibility to pass it on? Wouldn't you try to ensure that the next civilization didn't have to rediscover everything from scratch? Wouldn't you embed that knowledge in stories, monuments, and symbols designed to last through the next catastrophe? This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of ancient cultures, their obsession with preservation. The Egyptians built in stone specifically because it lasts. They carved their knowledge into granite walls that would survive flood and fire. They placed their most important texts in tombs sealed and hidden in desert cliffs. The Sumerians chose clay tablets, which when baked or accidentally fired during the burning of a library become virtually indestructible, lasting thousands of years in conditions that would obliterate paper or parchment. Megalithic cultures around the world encoded astronomical data into the layout and alignments of massive stone monuments that would survive almost any disaster short of complete geological upheaval. Why this obsession with permanence? Why this drive to preserve information in the most durable way possible? Perhaps because they knew, perhaps because they or their ancestors had experienced the loss of knowledge and were determined not to let it happen again. Consider the precession of the equinoxes, a phenomenon discovered by the Greek astronomer Hipparchus around 130 BC. Precession is the slow wobble of Earth's axis, which takes approximately 26,000 years to complete one full cycle. This wobble causes the position of the stars in the sky to gradually shift over centuries and millennia. It is a subtle effect, requiring long-term careful observation to detect. Modern astronomy has confirmed it and measured it precisely. But here is the problem. Multiple ancient cultures knew about precession long before Hipparchus. The ancient Egyptians tracked it. The builders of various megalithic sites encoded it into their monuments. Hindu astronomy is built around it. How did they know? The standard answer is that they didn't. That scholars are reading too much into coincidental alignments and numbers. But if they did know, if they actually observed and measured this 26,000-year cycle, it means they had continuous, sophisticated astronomical observation for far longer than civilization is supposed to have existed. It means there was a previous age of astronomical science that preserved and passed down its data. The number 26,000, or variations close to it, appears repeatedly in ancient texts and monuments. The Mayan long count calendar uses a period of 26,000 tons. The Hindu yugas total 4.32 million years, but break down into sub-cycles, one of which is 25,920 years, remarkably close to the actual precession cycle. Plato in his Timaeus describes a perfect year lasting 25,920 regular years. Where did these numbers come from? Are they pure invention, or are they inherited data? Fragments of an older scientific tradition that understood cosmic cycles and tried to warn future generations about the patterns of catastrophe embedded in those cycles. If we accept that knowledge was preserved and passed down from previous cycles, it raises a tantalizing and terrifying question. What else did they know? What else did they try to tell us? The ancient texts are full of what we dismiss as mythology: gods battling in the heavens, planets changing orbits, fire and ice destroying the earth, humans being created and recreated multiple times. What if these are not Faid or fairy tales, but distorted accounts of real cosmic events? What if the gods are not supernatural beings, but natural forces or celestial bodies that previous civilizations observed and tried to warn us about? What if the story of Nibiru, the supposed hidden planet in Sumerian mythology, is not about a physical planet at all, but about a cyclical celestial event that returns at predictable intervals? What if the references to 6 previous ages in various mythologies are literal? 6 previous attempts at civilization wiped out by the forces that govern the cosmos, and we, stumbling in the ruins, trying to piece together what they knew? The more you dig into ancient texts with this framework, the more unsettling connexions appear. References to previous humanities, descriptions of creation events that sound disturbingly like nuclear reactions, accounts of flying machines and advanced weapons. Now, the ancient astronaut theorists take this evidence and conclude that aliens visited and gave us technology. But there is a simpler, more grounded explanation. What if our own ancestors, in previous iterations of civilization, achieved knowledge and capabilities that we have only recently rediscovered? What if the nuclear devastation described in the Mahabharata, the flying Vimanas, the devastating Brahmastra weapon, are not alien technology but human technology from a previous cycle? What if we have been here before, reached for the stars before, built wonders before, and destroyed ourselves before, leaving only myths to warn the survivors? This is the deepest implication of the seventh civilization theory. It suggests that human nature itself is the constant, that regardless of how advanced we become, we carry within us the seeds of our own destruction. Pride, hubris, the lust for power, the willingness to sacrifice long-term survival for short-term gain. These are not modern problems, they are ancient problems, eternal problems, and they have destroyed us before, 6 times before. The cosmic catastrophes, the impacts and ice ages might be the triggers, but our inability to prepare, to heed warnings, to work together in the face of existential threat, that is the actual mechanism of our doom. The universe doesn't destroy us, we destroy ourselves, and the universe merely provides the opportunity. Now, let us turn to the most pressing question of all. If the pattern is real, if civilizations do rise and fall in cycles, are we approaching the next reset? Are there signs that the cosmic clock is winding down toward midnight once more? This is where the theory moves from ancient history to modern prophecy, from the safety of discussing the past to the danger of confronting our present and future. And this is where things get truly controversial, where science, mythology, and conspiracy intersect in ways that make scholars deeply uncomfortable. Look at our current moment in history. We live in an age of unprecedented technological power and simultaneously unprecedented fragility. We have built a global civilization that depends entirely on complex, interconnected systems. Food, water, power, communications all require vast infrastructure that is vulnerable to disruption. We have weapons capable of destroying all life on the planet multiple times over. We have altered the chemistry of the atmosphere and oceans. We have driven extinction rates to levels not seen since the dinosaurs died 66 million years ago. We are, in many ways, conducting the exact same experiment that previous civilizations might have conducted. The experiment of pushing the boundaries, of assuming that progress is infinite and that consequences can be managed or ignored. And just like previous iterations, we are discovering that the natural world has limits, and that pushing past those limits has consequences we cannot control. At the same time, scientists are increasingly aware of cosmic threats that we cannot prevent with our current technology. Near-Earth asteroids that could strike with minimal warning, solar flares and coronal mass ejections that could fry our electronics and send us back to the 19th century overnight, supervolcano eruptions that are overdue by geological standards, rapid climate shifts that the geological record shows can happen within a human lifetime. We are not as safe as we think we are. The illusion of stability that modern life provides is just that, an illusion. And some researchers argue that we are entering a window of increased risk, a period when multiple threats converge. The precession cycle provides one possible timeline. We are currently about halfway through a complete precession, roughly 13,000 years past the Younger Dryas event. If the pattern holds, if major catastrophes cluster around precession half cycles, we are approaching or possibly already in the next danger zone. This is highly speculative, and mainstream science does not support the idea of regular catastrophic cycles linked to precession. But it is worth noting that ancient cultures seem to believe such a link existed. The elaborate calculations of the Mayans, predicting the end of a world age, the Hindu descriptions of the Kali Yuga leading to destruction and renewal, the Egyptian and Greek traditions of multiple ages ending in cataclysm, they all point to the same rough time frame, and we are living in that time frame now. The conspiracy theories around this are extensive and elaborate. Some claim that governments know about an incoming threat and are hiding it from the public to prevent panic. Secret space programs, deep underground bases for elites, strange construction projects, suppression of archaeological discoveries that would reveal the truth about previous catastrophes. The problem with conspiracy theories is that they are unfalsifiable. Any lack of evidence is taken as proof of cover-up, but that doesn't mean they are entirely wrong. Governments do keep secrets. Classified programs exist. And if there were credible evidence of an incoming global catastrophe, would they tell us? Or would they quietly prepare, ensuring that a select few could survive to restart civilization while leaving the rest of humanity ignorant until the end? The seventh civilization theory, taken to its logical conclusion, suggests that this has all happened before. That previous elites knew disaster was coming and built their arks, their bunkers, their seed vaults. That previous civilizations had their warnings and their prophets telling them to change course, and they ignored them until it was too late. And that we are doing exactly the same thing. The warnings are all around us, in the ancient texts, in the geological record, in the increasing frequency of extreme weather and ecological collapse. But we continue as if nothing is wrong, as if progress will save us, as if we are somehow exempt from the patterns that govern the rise and fall of all living systems. But here is the critical thing. The theory does not say that destruction is inevitable or that we are doomed. It says that the pattern exists, that there is a rhythm, a cycle, a test that civilizations face. Some previous iterations failed that test completely and vanished. But others left survivors, left knowledge, left seeds of continuity. The test is not whether we can prevent catastrophe entirely. The test is whether we can recognize it coming, prepare for it, preserve what matters, and ensure that something survives to carry on. The test is whether we can break the cycle of amnesia, the pattern of forgetting the lessons of the past and having to relearn them the hard way. And on that test, we are currently failing badly because we have forgotten that there were lessons to learn. If the Sumerian tablets are right, if we truly are the seventh civilization, then we have 6 previous examples to study. 6 iterations that made it far enough to leave some kind of record before the reset came. What did they do right? They preserved knowledge in durable forms. They built monuments that would survive catastrophe. They recorded their histories and passed them down through oral tradition and written texts. They tried to warn us. What did they do wrong? They didn't prepare sufficiently. They didn't take the threat seriously until it was too late. They allowed themselves to believe that their civilization was permanent, that they were special, that the rules didn't apply to them. And they were proven catastrophically wrong. We have advantages that previous iterations did not. We have global communications. We can share knowledge instantly across the entire planet. We have space technology, the theoretical ability to detect incoming threats and possibly deflect them. We have genetics. We can preserve DNA in the seeds of 1 million species. We have digital storage. We can record the entirety of human knowledge on devices the size of a thumb. But we also have vulnerabilities that previous civilizations did not. We have put all our eggs in one basket, creating a single interconnected global system where a failure in one place cascades everywhere. We have created weapons that can trigger our own extinction without any help from cosmic forces. We have become so dependent on technology that most humans could not survive for a week without the infrastructure that provides food, water, and shelter. The seventh civilization theory forces us to confront these vulnerabilities. It asks uncomfortable questions. If the power grid went down permanently tomorrow, how many people would die? If global supply chains collapsed, how long would cities remain habitable? If a solar flare fried all electronics, how would we communicate, coordinate, rebuild? If sea levels rose suddenly by 200 feet, drowning every coastal city on Earth, how would civilization survive? We don't like thinking about these scenarios because they are frightening, but previous civilizations didn't like thinking about them either, and their unwillingness to confront existential risk did not make the risk go away. It just made them unprepared when the risk materialized. So what should we do? If we accept, even as a possibility, that cyclical catastrophes are real and that we might be approaching another one, what is the appropriate response? The ancient answer was to build monuments, preserve knowledge, and hope that survivors would find and understand the warnings. We can do better. We can establish redundant systems, distributed knowledge repositories, both digital and physical, stored in locations that would survive various catastrophic scenarios. We can train people in essential skills that don't depend on modern infrastructure. We can create networks of seed banks, genetic archives, and tool repositories that could allow survivors to rebuild faster. We can invest in space technology, not just for exploration but for species survival, establishing off-world colonies that would ensure human continuity even if Earth became uninhabitable. We can study the ancient texts and geological records seriously, looking for patterns and warnings instead of dismissing them as primitive myths. But more than any technological or logistical preparation, we need a shift in consciousness. We need to internalize the lesson that the Sumerians tried to teach us, that civilization is not a given, that it is fragile, temporary, and precious, that it must be actively maintained and defended, that we are custodians of something that was passed down to us through unimaginable suffering and sacrifice, and we have a responsibility to pass it on to those who come after us. The seventh civilization theory is not about proving that 6 previous versions existed. It is about recognizing that if we are not the first, we will not be the last, and that our choices matter. Every civilization is given a choice when it reaches a certain level of power. Will it use that power wisely, with humility and long-term thinking? Or will it indulge in short-term gains, hubris and denial, gambling that the catastrophes described in ancient texts and geological records are just stories that could never happen to us? The clock is ticking. Not necessarily on some specific date predicted in ancient calendars or conspiracy theories, but certainly on a human timescale. Climate instability is accelerating, resource depletion is real, extinction rates are climbing, political tensions are rising, and overhead, in the dark between stars, are rocks with our name on them, objects that could end our story in an instant. We have been lucky so far. 6 previous iterations were not so lucky. Or perhaps they were lucky enough to leave survivors who could start over, who could become us. And now it is our turn. Our turn to decide whether we learn from the pattern or repeat it. Whether we heed the warnings carved in clay and stone or ignore them as we scroll through our phones and convince ourselves that progress is inevitable, and catastrophe is something that happens to other people in other times. The Sumerian tablets sit in museums now, behind glass, silent. The ziggurat at Ur crumbles slowly under the desert sun. Gobekli Tepe, once buried to preserve it, is now excavated and exposed, its secrets being slowly teased out by archaeologists who still debate what it means. The ancient voices are faint, filtered through thousands of years and multiple translations, but they are speaking. They are trying to tell us something that they considered vitally important. Important enough to preserve in the most durable materials they had. Important enough to encode in myths and monuments that would survive the end of their world. Are we listening? Or are we too busy, too distracted, too convinced of our own cleverness to hear? The theory of 7 civilizations is ultimately about hubris. The hubris of believing we are the first and the best, that nothing can touch us, that the warnings are for other people. It is about the cosmic joke that each civilization believes itself to be the pinnacle, the final version, when in fact it might just be the latest attempt in a series stretching back into the unimaginable past. And if we are the 7th, the question is not whether there will be an 8th. There probably will be, because life is stubborn and humanity is resilient. The question is whether we can be the civilization that finally breaks the pattern, that learns the lesson, that survives not by accident but by wisdom, or whether we will simply be another layer in the geological record Another set of ruins for the 8th civilization to puzzle over. Another cautionary tale carved in whatever medium survives our own destruction. The Sumerian scribes are long dead. Their cities are dust. Their language is extinct, but their warning remains. The cycle is real. The catastrophes come. The civilizations fall. And each time a few survive to start over. This time we have the knowledge, the technology, and the opportunity to do it differently. To prepare, to preserve, to escape. But only if we choose to. Only if we overcome the arrogance that blinded previous iterations. Only if we accept that we are not special, not exempt, not immune to the forces that have shaped human history from its very beginning. 7 civilizations. 6 fell. We are the 7th. The cosmic clock is ticking. The patterns repeat. And somewhere in a museum, a clay tablet covered in wedge-shaped marks tries desperately to warn us of what every previous civilization learned too late. That pride comes before the fall, that nothing lasts forever, and that the only question that matters is not whether the end will come, but whether we will be ready when it does. The sound of the wind howling across empty plains, the sensation of standing on the edge of something vast and terrible, the knowledge that we are not the beginning, and we might not be the end. This is what the 7th civilization theory gives us. Not certainty, not comfort, but awareness. The awareness that we are part of a pattern, that we are dancers in a cosmic ballet that has been choreographed by forces beyond our control, and that our only power is in how we dance, how we face what is coming, and what we leave behind for those who will dance after us. The tablets are silent now, the voices are still, but if you listen carefully, in the quiet moments, you can almost hear them. The ancient scribes, the survivors, the builders, the teachers, they are whispering across the gulf of time. They are saying, remember, prepare, preserve. Do not make our mistakes. Do not believe you are invincible. Do not ignore the signs. The cycle turns. The pattern repeats. And you are running out of time. Are we the 7th and final civilization? Or are we the 7th in a series that will continue long after we are gone? The answer depends entirely on what we do next. On whether we listen to the warnings or drown them out with the noise of our own confidence. On whether we learn from the past or are condemned to repeat it. The Sumerians tried to tell us. The clay tablets are there, waiting. The message is clear. The question is, are we wise enough to hear it? The darkness is complete now. The words on the tablets fade from view, but they remain, as they have remained for 5,000 years, waiting for the next civilization to discover them, to read them, to understand, waiting for us. The 7th, perhaps the last. Perhaps just the latest. Time will tell. The cosmic clock ticks on, and somewhere in the depths of space or in the core of the Earth, or in the patterns of the sun, the next reset is being prepared. The only question is whether we will be ready, whether we will survive, whether the 8th civilization, if there is one, will find our tablets and wonder what we knew, what we tried to preserve, and whether we learned the lesson that cost 6 previous humanities everything they had built. Sleep now if you can. Dream of ancient cities and distant stars, of catastrophes survived and civilizations risen from the ashes. And when you wake, look at the world with new eyes. Look at our fragile global civilization, our temporary monuments, our fleeting technologies, and ask yourself, what would we want the next ones to know? What should we preserve? What warnings should we carve in stone? And most importantly, what will we do differently so that we don't become just another ghost in the long, sad history of humanity's repeated rise and fall? The 7th civilization stands at a crossroads. The path forward branches. One leads to survival, wisdom, and breaking the pattern. The other leads to the same fate that claimed all the others. The choice, improbable as it seems, is ours. The Sumerians made their choice. They preserved their knowledge, built their monuments, and left us their warnings. They survived long enough to pass the torch, now we hold it. The question is, will we pass it on? Or will we let it be extinguished, leaving the 8th civilization, if there is one, to start from scratch, with no memory of us, no record of our achievements, just another mysterious gap in the human story, another cycle completed, another warning unheeded? The tablets are there. The message is clear. We are the 7th, and our time is running out. But let us not end in darkness. Let us instead examine more closely what these warnings actually contain and what modern science is discovering that validates or challenges the ancient narrative. Because the debate between those who see cyclical catastrophes as literal truth and those who see them as metaphorical myth is not as clear-cut as either side would have you believe. The reality, as is often the case, is more nuanced, more complex, and ultimately more fascinating than the simple dichotomies of belief versus skepticism. Return with me to that moment in 1872 when George Smith first read the flood account from Nineveh. The shockwaves from that discovery are still reverberating through archaeology and biblical studies today. But focus on a detail that often gets overlooked in the excitement of discovering an ancient flood myth. The Babylonian flood story that Smith translated was not original to the Babylonians. They inherited it from the Sumerians, and they knew they inherited it. The tablets Smith was reading were copies, and the scribes who copied them noted that they were working from much older sources. This pattern of copying and recopying, of preserving texts that were already ancient, is consistent throughout Mesopotamian history. The library of Ashurbanipal, where Smith's tablets came from, was explicitly a project of preservation. King Ashurbanipal, who ruled in the 7th century BC, sent scribes throughout his empire to collect and copy every text they could find. He wanted to preserve the wisdom of the past. And among the texts his scribes collected were accounts that even to them were impossibly old, texts that claimed to preserve events from before the Great Flood. Why would a sophisticated empire with advanced administration, law and engineering bother preserving what they surely must have recognised as fantastical accounts of 28,000-year reigns and divine kings? The obvious answer is that they believed, or at least could not rule out, that these texts contained important truth. Not necessarily literal truth in every detail, but core truth about the nature of the world, the fragility of civilization, and the patterns of cosmic catastrophe. This brings us to an important distinction that is often lost in debates about ancient texts. The question is not whether every word is literally true or completely false. The question is what kind of truth the texts are trying to convey. When the Enuma Elish describes the god Marduk slaying the chaos dragon Tiamat and creating the world from her body, no serious scholar believes this is a literal description of planetary formation. But many scholars recognise that the text is expressing profound truths about order emerging from chaos, about the necessity of overcoming primordial forces to create stable civilization, about the violent cosmic energies that shaped our world. These are truths expressed in mythological language because the people who wrote them did not have the scientific vocabulary we possess, but the truths remain valid. Now apply this same interpretive framework to the accounts of previous world ages and cyclical catastrophes. When the Sumerians speak of 6 ages before ours, they may not mean 6 complete technological civilizations identical to our own. They may mean 6 major epochs of human development, each ending in a crisis that forced humanity to reorganize and rebuild. They may mean 6 astronomical cycles, periods marked by celestial events that reset the conditions for human life. They may mean 6 spiritual or consciousness ages, stages in the evolution of human awareness, or they may mean exactly what the texts appear to say, that there have been 6 previous complete civilizations that rose to heights we cannot imagine and fell to destruction we cannot comprehend. The texts themselves do not give us enough detail to know for certain which interpretation is correct. What they do give us, consistently across multiple cultures, is the clear message that history is not linear, that catastrophes have happened before, and that they will happen again. The scientific evidence for this cyclical pattern is mixed but increasingly compelling. Let us look more deeply at the Younger Dryas event because it serves as our best example of a recent datable global catastrophe that had profound effects on human civilization. The mainstream explanation for the Younger Dryas, the one taught in most geology courses, involves the sudden release of glacial meltwater from Lake Agassiz, a massive body of water trapped behind ice dams in North America. As the Ice Age was ending, these dams failed, and a volume of fresh water equivalent to all the Great Lakes combined poured into the North Atlantic over a matter of weeks or months. This influx disrupted the ocean's thermohaline circulation, the system of currents that brings warm water from the tropics to the northern latitudes. When this circulation shut down, northern regions lost their primary heat source and plunged back into Ice Age conditions. This explanation is elegant and fits the evidence fairly well. The geology supports massive meltwater discharge events. Ocean sediment cores show disruptions in circulation. The timing matches, and it doesn't require any exotic mechanisms or cosmic interventions. It is gradualism and uniformitarianism at work, extreme events, but caused by processes we understand. But there are problems. The abruptness of the cooling is hard to explain with the meltwater mechanism alone. Temperature reconstructions from ice cores show drops happening within a decade, perhaps within a few years. Ocean circulation changes usually take longer to propagate through the system. The extinction of the megafauna is also puzzling. Why would a climate cooling event, similar to conditions these animals had survived multiple times during the previous ice age, suddenly kill them all off? And why would the Clovis culture, highly adaptable humans, vanish from the archaeological record right at the Younger Dryas boundary? This is where the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis offers a more complete answer. The impact scenario explains the rapidity of the changes, the extinction of the megafauna through direct killing and habitat destruction, the disappearance of Clovis culture through population collapse, and the climate effects through a combination of impact winter and circulation disruption. It also explains evidence that the meltwater hypothesis does not address. The widespread layer of black matte sediment containing charcoal across North America, consistent with massive wildfires, the presence of nanodiamonds, platinum enrichment, and magnetic spherules at sites across multiple continents, the apparent burning and abandonment of early sites at exactly the Younger Dryas boundary, and intriguingly the cultural response that followed. After the Younger Dryas, after whatever happened 12,800 years ago, human behaviour changes. We see the first monumental architecture at Gobekli Tepe. We see the rapid development of agriculture in multiple centres. We see the appearance of more sophisticated social organisation. It is as if humanity, having survived a near-extinction event, decided to get serious about civilization. This pattern makes more sense if the catastrophe was sudden and traumatic, something that would have deeply affected the survivor psychology and motivated them to build something permanent to preserve knowledge, to create buffer against future disaster. It makes less sense if the Younger Dryas was just a gradual climate wobble. The scientific debate over the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis has been fierce and often personal. This is actually a sign that something important is at stake. Scientists generally don't get emotional about ideas that don't matter. The resistance to the impact hypothesis comes from multiple sources. First, there is the reasonable scientific conservatism that requires extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims. Claiming that Earth was hit by multiple comet fragments 12,800 years ago is an extraordinary claim. Second, there is the problem of reproducibility. Some research teams have found the impact markers, others have not. This inconsistency is troubling and suggests either contamination, misidentification, or highly localized phenomena. Third, there is the broader issue of catastrophism versus uniformitarianism. Accepting that a comet impact fundamentally altered Earth's climate and ecology just 12,800 years ago opens the door to accepting other catastrophic events in human history, and that door has been kept firmly shut by mainstream geology for over a century. But science advances when anomalies accumulate and when new evidence forces paradigm shifts. The impact hypothesis, despite fierce opposition, has not been definitively disproven. Instead, it has evolved and strengthened as more sites have been studied and as proponents have refined their arguments. Multiple independent research teams have now confirmed the presence of platinum anomalies at the Younger Dryas boundary across multiple continents. Platinum is rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids and comets. Its sudden spike at this specific time period is hard to explain through normal geological processes. Similarly, the nanodiamonds, while controversial, continue to be found by multiple teams using improved analytical techniques. The debate is far from settled, but the hypothesis is alive and generating productive research. What does this mean for the seventh civilization theory? It means that the core premise, that Earth experiences periodic catastrophic events capable of destroying civilizations, has scientific support. We know impacts happen. We know they can cause mass extinctions. We know climate can shift with shocking rapidity. The question is not whether such events are possible, but whether they follow a pattern, whether they are predictable, and whether ancient cultures recognize this pattern and try to warn us. This is where we must look at the astronomical evidence for cyclical phenomena. Earth's orbit and axial orientation change over time in predictable patterns called Milankovitch cycles, named after Serbian scientist Milutin Milankovic, who calculated them in the 1920s. These cycles include the eccentricity of Earth's orbit, which varies from nearly circular to slightly elliptical over a period of about 100,000 years, the tilt of Earth's axis, which varies between 22.1 and 24.5 degrees over about 41,000 years, and the precession of the axis, the wobble that completes one rotation every 26,000 years. These orbital variations affect how much solar radiation Earth receives and are thought to be the primary drivers of ice age cycles. But here is where it gets interesting. The precession cycle, the 26,000-year wobble, is divided into two significant half periods of about 13,000 years each. During each half cycle, Earth's orientation relative to the Sun changes such that the seasons are reversed between the two poles. When the northern hemisphere is tilted toward the Sun during its summer, as it is now, the southern hemisphere experiences its winter. But 13,000 years ago, this was reversed. This flip in seasonal orientation happens gradually over thousands of years, but there are critical transition points where Earth's configuration is particularly unstable or where it intersects with other cosmic phenomena. Some researchers have proposed that these transition points correspond to periods of increased catastrophic activity. The Younger Dryas event occurred at one such transition point. If you go back another 13,000 years, to approximately 26,000 years ago, you find another major climate disruption and another apparent gap in the human archaeological record. Go back further, in increments of roughly 12,000 to 13,000 years, and you find a pattern of climate instability, mass extinctions, and cultural discontinuities. Is this pattern real, or is it cherry-picking data to fit in a preconceived theory? The jury is still out, but the fact that ancient cultures seemed aware of the approximately 26,000-year precession cycle and embedded it in their monuments and mythologies suggests that they might have been tracking something real. The ancient Egyptians, for example, appear to have been obsessed with precession. The pyramids and the Sphinx are aligned with astonishing precision to cardinal directions and celestial bodies. But here is the fascinating part. The Sphinx, according to some researchers, shows evidence of water erosion that could only have occurred during a period of much heavier rainfall than Egypt has experienced in recorded history. The standard geological consensus is that such rainfall last occurred in Egypt around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, which would make the Sphinx far older than Egyptology claims. If the Sphinx was carved around 10,000 BC, right after the Younger Dryas, it would be contemporary with Gobekli Tepe and would represent a similarly inexplicable achievement for people who supposedly had just emerged from hunter-gatherer existence. Why would a post-catastrophe culture prioritise building a massive stone lion with a human head? One interpretation is that it served as a marker, a waypoint, a monument designed to preserve astronomical data. The Sphinx originally faced due east, looking directly at the rising sun on the spring equinox. But due to precession, the constellation that rises behind the sun on the spring equinox changes over the 26,000-year cycle. Currently it is Pisces, transitioning to Aquarius, but around 10,500 BC it was Leo. The Sphinx, with its lion body, may be marking the age of Leo, indicating to future observers when it was constructed, and encoding the knowledge of precession into its very form. This is highly speculative, but it fits a pattern we see at other ancient sites where astronomical knowledge seems far more advanced than it should be for the claimed time period. Stonehenge in England, built around 3000 to 2000 BC, according to conventional dating, is aligned with incredible precision to the summer solstice sunrise and winter solstice sunset. It also appears to track lunar cycles and may have been used to predict eclipses. The sophistication required for this level of astronomical observation suggests a long tradition of skywatching and mathematical calculation. Where did this tradition come from? Was it developed independently by Neolithic British farmers? Or was it inherited knowledge, passed down from earlier cultures who had more pressing reasons to track the heavens because they had experienced what happens when certain celestial alignments occur? The Mayan pyramids in Central America, built over 1,000 years from approximately 300 BC to 900 AD, are oriented with extraordinary precision. The pyramid at Chichen Itza creates a shadow serpent that appears to crawl down the steps during the equinoxes. The Mayans had multiple calendar systems that track time in cycles ranging from 260 days to periods of millions of years. Their long count calendar, which caused so much apocalyptic speculation around 2012, measured time from a starting point in 3114 BC and tracked a cycle of approximately 5,125 years. But this was not their only or even their most important calendar. They tracked longer cycles, including the precession cycle, and they spoke of multiple world ages that had ended in destruction. Why would a culture without telescopes or modern instruments devote such effort to tracking cosmic cycles? Perhaps because they had cultural memories of what happens when those cycles reach certain critical points. What we are seeing across multiple ancient cultures is a consistent pattern of astronomical obsession. Not the casual observation of the sky that any agricultural society would need to track seasons, but deep, mathematical, multi-generational projects to record and predict celestial events over timescales far longer than any individual civilization. This suggests that the knowledge was considered vitally important enough to dedicate massive resources to its preservation. And the most consistent explanation for why it was considered important is that it was predictive knowledge that allowed them to forecast periods of danger, knowledge inherited from those who had survived previous catastrophes and who desperately wanted to give their descendants a better chance. Now, we must address the most difficult question of all. If cyclical catastrophes are real, if ancient cultures knew about them and tried to warn us, why are we not better prepared? Why does modern civilization seem almost willfully ignorant of these possibilities? The answer lies in the nature of human psychology and the structure of modern institutions. We are very good at dealing with threats that are immediate and visible. A predator attacking, a fire spreading, an enemy army approaching. Our brains evolved to handle these clear and present dangers. We are very bad at dealing with threats that are distant in time, uncertain in magnitude, and requiring sacrifice now to prevent harm later. Climate change is a perfect example. The science is clear, the trend is undeniable, but because the worst effects are decades in the future, and because addressing it requires changes to our comfortable present, we procrastinate and rationalize. Cyclical catastrophes, if they exist, are the ultimate long-term threat. They operate on timescales of thousands of years. The last one was 12,800 years ago. Most humans cannot meaningfully conceive of 1,000 years, let alone 12,000. We struggle to plan for our retirement 30 years in the future. Asking people to take seriously a threat that might manifest in decades or centuries or even longer is asking the impossible of our psychological architecture. Add to this the fact that institutions, governments, corporations, academic disciplines all operate on even shorter timeframes. A politician thinks about the next election, a CEO thinks about the next quarter, a scientist thinks about the next grant cycle. No one is institutionally empowered or incentivized to think in terms of cosmic cycles or civilization-ending threats. Furthermore, there is a deep psychological resistance to the idea that we are not special, that we are not the first and final iteration of humanity, that we are subject to the same forces that destroyed previous ages. This resistance manifests as incredulity when confronted with evidence of advanced ancient knowledge. Surely the pyramids could not have been built by ancient Egyptians without modern tools, therefore aliens must have helped them. This is the ancient astronaut fallacy. It rests on the unconscious assumption that ancient people were stupid, that they could not have achieved what they clearly did achieve through their own intelligence and effort. But it also rests on a deeper fear. The fear that if ancient people were that capable, and if their civilization still collapsed, then our own capabilities offer no protection. We prefer to believe in aliens because aliens are external, exotic, and ultimately not our problem. We don't want to believe in cyclical catastrophes because that means we have a problem that all our technology and sophistication cannot solve. But denial does not make reality go away. The geological record is clear. Mass extinctions happen. Climate shifts happen. Impacts happen. The only question is the timescale and the predictability. The ancient texts suggest that these events follow patterns, that they can be anticipated, and that preparation is possible. Modern science is beginning, reluctantly and with much debate, to acknowledge that catastrophic events are more common and more predictable than uniformitarian orthodoxy allowed. The synthesis of ancient wisdom and modern science could give us something neither had alone, the warning combined with the technology to act on that warning. What would adequate preparation look like? It would start with taking the threat seriously, elevating it from fringe speculation to mainstream concern. It would require international cooperation on a scale we have never achieved, because regional preparations are useless against global catastrophes. It would demand significant investment in redundant systems, distributed infrastructure that could continue functioning even if large portions were destroyed. It would necessitate the creation of knowledge repositories, physical archives in geologically stable locations containing the essential information needed to rebuild civilization, combined with global digital networks that could be preserved and restored. It would require space infrastructure, not as a vanity project but as a survival imperative, getting enough of humanity off the planet that a catastrophe on Earth would not mean extinction, and it would require a cultural shift, a fundamental change in how we think about time, responsibility, and our place in the cosmos. This cultural shift is perhaps the most important and the most difficult. We need to develop what some philosophers call cathedral thinking, the mindset of the medieval masons who started building cathedrals knowing they would not live to see them completed, working on projects that would benefit their grandchildren's grandchildren. We need to think in terms of generations, of centuries of the long game. We need to internalize the lesson that the Sumerians left us, that we are temporary stewards of something precious and fragile, that we are one link in a chain stretching back into the unimaginable past and hopefully forward into an equally distant future, and that our job is not to build an eternal civilization because no such thing is possible, but to ensure that the chain is not broken on our watch. The seventh civilization theory, stripped of all the speculative elements and controversies, comes down to this core message. We are not the beginning. We are not the end. We are in the middle of something vast, part of a pattern of rise and fall that has played out before and will play out again. Previous iterations gave us gifts, knowledge encoded in texts and monuments, warnings carved in stone, genetic and cultural inheritance that allowed us to reach where we are today. We have a responsibility to pass those gifts forward, to add to them, to be worthy ancestors for those who will come after. And we have a responsibility to heed the warnings, to take seriously the possibility that the pattern is not broken, that the cosmic clock is still ticking, and that our time may be shorter than we want to believe. In the quiet of a museum, the clay tablets wait. In the desert, the ancient stone stands silent under the stars. In the ice cores and sediment layers, the record of past catastrophes is preserved. And in our collective human mythology, spanning every culture and continent, the stories are told again and again. Stories of floods and fires, of worlds that ended and worlds that began, of ages of gods and ages of men, of warnings ignored and prices paid. These are not random stories. They are our inheritance. They are the accumulated wisdom of everyone who came before us, distilled into narrative form because narrative is what human brains remember. The question that faces the seventh civilization is whether we will listen, whether we will add our own chapter to the story, a chapter that breaks the pattern, that shows it is possible to survive the test, to prepare for the catastrophe, and to emerge on the other side stronger and wiser. Or whether our chapter will be a repeat of all the others, a tale of hubris and denial, of a civilization that had every advantage, every tool, every piece of knowledge it needed to survive, and that failed anyway because we could not overcome our own psychology, our own short-term thinking, our own inability to believe that the rules apply to us. The Sumerians are gone, their language is dead, their cities are ruins, but their message survives because they made sure it would survive. They wrote it in clay that turns to stone in fire. They encoded it in mathematics that transcend language. They built monuments that mock the passage of time. They did their part. They rang the bell, sounded the alarm, left the warning. Now it is our turn. Our turn to decide whether we are wise enough to hear what they are saying, whether we are brave enough to act on it, whether we are humble enough to accept that we are not special, not exempt, not the final word in the human story, but just another iteration trying to survive long enough to pass the torch. The clock ticks, the stars turn, the precession cycle continues its slow, inexorable rotation. And we stand here, the seventh civilization, at a crossroads that all the others faced. The path forward branches, one direction leading to survival and continuity, the other to the fate that claimed all previous attempts. The choice, impossible as it seems, is ours, not through individual action but through collective will, through the decisions we make as a species about what we value and what we are willing to sacrifice to preserve it. The tablets are there. The warnings are clear. The pattern is established. And time, as it always does, is running out.